I welcome you all this morning, and thanks for joining us on a Friday morning here at New America Foundation and latest in our America Strategy Program, Middle East Initiative pre-Annapolis briefings. I think we'll know pretty soon what the date of this conference is. I'm not sure if we'll discover much else even after the conference has taken place, but we thought we'd put on some events in the build-up, and this one I think is probably going to be the most informative, just in terms of actually getting down into the details of really one of the key issues one will be going back to if indeed we're back on a track of serious Israeli negotiations, which haven't taken place now on the core issues for 7 years. In fact, for 7 years, Dan, I'm sure you must have felt this, one's almost felt like a member of the Flat Earth Society to even discuss permanent borders or what the negotiations on territory might look like. And I think that one good thing that has come out of this already is that you can again go back to looking at those issues and not be institutionalized as a consequence. And the person who's going to walk us through these issues is Dan Rothem. Dan Rothem was born in Tel Aviv. He spent 7 years in the US and has moved back to Israel, which already puts you in a pretty impressively unique category, unlike certain people sitting around the table, Mickey. Dan was here for 5 years. I'm sorry, I shouldn't pick on people who come and attend the events. Dan was for 5 years the Director of Research at the Center for Middle East Peace and Economic Cooperation here in Washington. And during the latter part of that period, in fact during much of that period, Dan has been involved in a project both here and in Israel to put together, I'm not sure whether I could say, the most impressive database on and presentation and material on all the territorial aspect of the territories other than what is available to the IDF, because I'm not even sure whether they've got something of the level of detail that you have, Dan. He's done that with people who were my colleagues at the Economic Cooperation Foundation, amongst other places, back in Israel, and has worked especially closely with someone called Shaul Arieli, who was the lead Israeli negotiator on all the territorial issues, was head of the peace administration under Barak. And what they've done, and Dan will share with us shortly, is taken the various options that have been raised in negotiations, looked at the whole settlement pattern, looked at the route of the separation barrier, something that Dan has been very involved in. Some of you will be familiar with there having been a series of legal challenges in the Israeli Supreme Court to the route of the fence wall separation barrier. And Dan has been involved in preparing the materials for those challenges, because what they've relied on is very detailed assessment of where the outer boundary of settlements is, road use, things like that. And Dan has been working with the Council for Peace and Security, which is a group of retired generals, senior police, intelligence agency people in Israel, and they've led the challenge in the Supreme Court to some of the route of the barrier. Dan, and I should mention this and thank the United States Institute for Peace, who have facilitated Dan's visit to Washington from Tel Aviv. Dan has spent the last couple of days briefing officials, doing briefings on the Hill, and I think has helped the people who are actually preparing on the American side for their own homework in advance of Annapolis and what will probably follow Annapolis. I should give a shout out to Americans for Peace Now as well, and Lara Friedman's here with us, and they have been seminal in organising Dan's schedule and in making him available to us this morning. The most important biographical tidbit about Dan and what he did this last summer, I think I'll leave to Dan to fill in. But as a hint, someone had the idea of having a short baseball season in Israel over the summer, and what they did was they brought in a load of players from the United States, but from a few other countries as well, set up a mini league, and ran a, what was it, 3 months? Less?
2 months.
2 month. 2 month baseball tournament. I don't understand baseball. This is obvious from my accent. Season. There you go. The commissioner was Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, who was perhaps preparing for greater things in the baseballing world here in the United States in the future. And the most valued Israeli player is with us here today, Dan Rothem.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. I usually like doing this standing up, but I won't for now. And if I feel like I'm falling asleep, then I'll stand up. And you'll have to move to the other side. I will need to turn off the lights because most of the interesting stuff will be out there, so up there. So please look at it. And are we taping this? Because
we're taping this out. Yes, great.
Okay, any way to turn these lights off too, and maybe turn on lights back there, just so that people can see better what's really important and not my.
Yes. Give me 1 minute.
Awesome. Okay, we'll get into a level of details here that is definitely way beyond what even the most optimistic analyst can think that will be discussed in Annapolis. But the purpose of this is to take you 2 steps forward, to take whoever sees this 2 steps forward so that they can then move back and try to game out whatever it is they want to game in Annapolis, be it a statement of principles or just a general statement. Cool. So I've been working with the Center for Middle East Peace recently. And this database is also thanks to Danny Abraham, who funds the center. But first, let's have an update from the region. Again, the Israel Baseball League. And on August 19th, the evil Bet Shemesh Blue Sox beat the Modi'in Miracle 3-0 in the championship game. My beloved team, the one I was playing on, Tel Aviv Lightning, we didn't make it to the championship game, but we definitely established ourselves as an empire to be reckoned with. Next season, if any of you are in Israel over the next summer, please come out and watch the games. It is fun stuff.
Just to note, Israel does not yet have the imperial ambitions and the hubris to call Modi'in against Beit Shemesh the World Series.
We're working on it. Okay, I was asked to give a presentation, about maps and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, talking about the issue of borders, and a little bit touching on Jerusalem also, because Jerusalem has a territorial element to it. But my organization, we don't really like to dive back and talk about conflicts. We try to look prospectively at solutions. And maybe I should attach one more warning, and this will be the last jazzy thing coming up here. If you're here for one of those what went wrong sessions in the past, who started what was offered and this and that, you're behind 6 years. Those were long gone, and we're looking prospectively. We are going to draw back on previous negotiations to learn from that and maybe help us see what's feasible as far as an agreement in the future. But no mud throwing here. Let's talk a little bit about borders. And I'll run through this PowerPoint relatively quickly. If there are any meaningful questions, please yell out in the best of the Israeli costume. Just yell out in the middle because I can't really see hands. And then after this, it'll take me about 20 minutes, hopefully, to go through this. And then we'll switch to a GIS software. It's a software that's made of layers of data. It's much more interactive, and then I can answer, hopefully, whatever questions you have. And hopefully I have enough data here to be able to answer that. Let's look at the Palestinian classic attitude on the borders issue as they approach Annapolis, or whatever process will come out of Annapolis. The Palestinians look at historic Palestine and see their homeland, if you would. With the first internationally proposed partition plan for historic Palestine, in blue you see the proposed Jewish state according to the Peel Commission of a report of 1937. In green are what was supposed to be an Arab state, and in purple is the mandated territory back then. We will jump forward to 1947, and the partition plan, as you can see, the blue is growing and the green is shrinking. And this is kind of like the Palestinians have viewed the issue of borders throughout time. If we jump then forward to the 1967 lines, actually the lines, the armistice line that ended the war of 1948, 1949, you can see again the blue growing and the green shrinking. And finally, reality as Palestinians know it today, and hopefully you can all see my cursor, right? Yes. With large settlement blocks within the West Bank under Israeli control, as well as the Jordan Valley out here, and we'll get a closer look at that in a moment. Again, the blue growing, the green shrinking. And this is how Palestinians view the shrinking of Palestine and what they call the destroying of the two-state solution. And again, the official Palestinian position was 1967, actually a 78%, 22% division of historic Palestine. 78% for Israel, 22% for Palestine. That came in effect when they accepted UN Resolutions 242 and 338 in 1988 initially, and then reaffirmed it again in 1993 in the Declaration of Principles with Oslo. What could be expected from the Palestinians as they come to Annapolis or any sort of negotiations? You can definitely expect them to ask for a clear reference to the 1967 lines. If we talk about modifications to that line, we also bring into play land swaps. Palestinians would like the swaps to be equal in quantity and in quality. The Israeli annexation of the West Bank should probably be limited in scope as far as the Palestinian perspective goes, to 2%, maybe less. Finally, safe passage that will connect Gaza and the West Bank will be definitely on the agenda. Let's look at the Israeli classic approach to the borders issue. And Israeli thinking was very much influenced by military thinking. Israelis don't look at the entire Israel, Eretz Israel, or entire historic Palestine, if you would. They look much more closer at the West Bank and see, and see what are the interests of Israel there and how Israel can safeguard there. And again, it depends on who describes the interest, according to which. But this is the classic way that we Israelis have looked at the West Bank dating back to the 1970s. First of all, here you see in blue all the built-up areas of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. In purple, you see the municipal boundary of Jerusalem, as we Israel unilaterally declared in 1967. In the background, in lighter green, you see all the Palestinian localities in the West Bank. So, how would Israel go about, dealing with the West Bank as far as territory is concerned? This is a classic view. This doesn't really represent where Olmert is coming to this round. But first of all, large settlement blocks under Israeli annexation, here portrayed by the trajectory of the barrier Israel is building in and around the West Bank. Some sort of a long-term security presence along the Jordan River, the Jordan Valley. This has kind of remained constant, although the rationale for this has changed. It used to be the fear of armies from the east, from Jordan, from Iraq, coming and attacking Israel, and therefore Israel needs strategic depth. Now, with peace with Jordan and with, peace with America and Iraq, the fear of tanks from there is not really what dictates this, but the Israeli need, or some would call pseudo need, but their need to safeguard the envelope of the Palestinian entity to prevent smuggling of weapons and other things is a security rationale right now.
It's the red line of war.
I'm sorry? Yes, the red line is a trajectory, both existing and planned, of the barrier, yes, of the wall.
How many, what's the portion?
It's roughly 8.5% of the West Bank is on the Israeli side of the barrier. Okay?
Please take the cue from the gentleman. I'm sure Dan doesn't mind.
Right.
If anyone at any stage during the presentation has questions, clarifications, and it's on the map that's in front of you or the material Dan's presenting, don't feel you have to wait till the end. Just jump in there and
Right. Yes.
really start.
And I will give you an update on what's built and what's planned a little later on in the presentation. Okay? Finally, or not finally, but if we move ahead, okay, there are also a little bit of corridors there that sometimes Israelis want to throw up there, both to safeguard strategic areas in the West Bank, access, for example, to Hebron from the south, and largely creating, 3 large cantons in the West Bank for Palestinians and 1 in Gaza. Again, that's a classic Israeli way. It dates back to the Alon plan of 1970, then the Sharon plan that was developed in the later 70s, but they all fundamentally talk about the same things. There's also a little different variation of it with a more limited geographical presence. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. With a much more limited presence and geographical scope along the Jordan Valley. But again, the idea is the same idea. But as we look toward Annapolis or whatever follows Annapolis, what could be expected from an Israeli position, if you would, or Israeli demands, or for a week I've been struggling with what to call it. But anyway, as we talk about, if the sides talk about borders, Israel classically would not want a specific reference to 1967 lines. This needs maybe 2 asterisks to it. First one is Bush's speech in 2002 that talked about ending the occupation that started in 1967. I think it's the first time America has stepped forward and really articulated or referred to 1967 lines in the context of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second one is the exchange of letters in 2004 between Bush and Sharon that refer to the armistice line of 1949, which is, I guess, the more accurate legal term for the 1967 lines that did not enjoy any border status as far as international law is concerned. So this kind of gives the negotiators a little bit room to maneuver as they look at what the president has said before and maybe move on forward, trying to game out some sort of a statement, relevant statement from that. Israel would like maximum leeway on annexation and blocks. That's kind of self-explanatory. Minimal swaps, avoiding the 1-to-1 ratio would probably be a realistic Israeli position. And finally, a safe passage that will be used as negotiating leverage. Israel would say, well, we'd like to annex, more of the West Bank, 8, 9, 10, 13% of the West Bank. In exchange, we can swap maybe 2, 3% at most, and the rest should be compensated by Palestinian use of the safe passage. Its worth is much more than just the land that it actually takes. Whatever it is, this is how I evaluate the Israeli positions as we enter this kind of stage of final status. Let's look very briefly about the previous round of negotiations as we try to resolve the conflict. Hey, why not? As far as the peace process, Camp David, and I've seen a lot of press lately, and especially in Israel, they have a lot of mistakes there as far as attributing what was offered when and how many percentages and at what point of the negotiating process. Factual errors that should probably be corrected. I'm reminding you that the Camp David summit that a lot of people like to refer to was actually just one stage in a series of events and negotiations that took place between the end of 1999 and early 2001. The first round was official negotiations in 1999, then a nice long break to allow for the Syrian track to move forward that actually collapsed in March 2000. And intense negotiations in Stockholm before the Camp David summit that took place then in July. After that, some more negotiations between Gilad Sharon and Saeb Erekat, amongst others. Right after Camp David, the clearance parameters of December 2000, and finally the Taba negotiations of January 2001. It is so awkward to talk about this, sitting next to Daniel, who took part in many of these. So maybe he can shed some more light. I'm not going to talk about, obviously, the entire series of negotiations. I'm going to draw on some maps, a little bit from Camp David summit, then something that has to do with the Clinton parameters, and then Taba negotiations. But when people refer to the Camp David summit, usually they miss. But I take it as a code name for the entire process, and then sometimes the facts are a little bit more accurate. Let's look at the Camp David summit. There was never one authoritative Camp David proposal, as press usually referred to. The Israeli side drew several maps and put them on the table in Camp David. Shlomo Ben-Ami in his book articulates most of them, his book about the negotiations. Most of the maps portrayed roughly 12% annexation of the West Bank, large settlement blocks, and around 10 to 11% of robust presence along the Jordan Valley as sort of a long-term arrangement, and sometimes they call it lease, sometimes long-term lease, sometimes they call it with another title. Again, the keyboard can probably suffer or take whatever you throw on it, but the logic is a long-term security presence along the Jordan Valley, and the rest, roughly 77%, becoming a non-contiguous Palestinian state. That is in the Camp David summit. I've been trying to chase down a Camp David map from an Israeli source for the past 4 years, unsuccessfally. I'm not alone in that enterprise, and it'd be nice to challenge Israel a little bit to produce it. Daniel, do we have a Freedom of Information Act, something like
Very
that,
interesting.
in Israel?
Very close friends of mine are working on that.
Mhm.
I don't know if you know Rothem, if you remember Roy Penner.
Sure.
There's a new NGO, not-for-profit in Israel, trying to promote freedom of information legislation.
Okay.
And access to things.
Wow.
But
Okay.
thus far, we don't get it.
So far, I have to rely on Palestinian source. A couple of Israelis that were in Camp David looked at this map and said, okay, it's definitely, it projects what was offered early on in the Camp David summit. And as you can see again, large settlement blocks annexed into Israel, including the whole greater Jerusalem area, and some sort of long-term presence along the Jordan Valley, resulting in 3 large cantons, if you would, in the West Bank. That was kind of Barak, in his very militaristic approach going into the Camp David summit. Nonetheless, there was also verbal communications articulated in Camp David, the summit itself, and Dennis Ross articulates it in his book, or writes about it in his book. And those included more limited annexation, roughly 9%, and also a commitment, if you would, to a 1% swap, much more limited presence along the Jordan River, and finally, further discussions about Jerusalem and dividing Jerusalem toward a demographic division of Jerusalem, meaning Jewish neighborhoods remaining under Israeli sovereignty, and at the time some Palestinian or Arab neighborhoods coming under Palestinian sovereignty. Again, these were verbal communications and no map was attached to them, although Dennis in his book draws one based on it. The American side was in constant drafting mode throughout the Camp David summit of its own proposal, but for some reason the powers that be decided not to present it during the summit. They wanted to present it early on in the fall, but violence broke out, and then they pushed it back and pushed it back and pushed it back and pushed it back. Finally, Clinton is, sliding down towards the end of his term. Barack is going to elections. The American side decided to present what is today known as the Clinton parameters. And here you see what Clinton has proposed as far as his parameters: between 3 and 6% annexation for Israel of the West Bank, and between 1 and 3 swap back into Palestine, which gives you the equivalent of 97% of the territories. He also outlined a couple of criteria, if you would: 80% of settlers in blocks, contiguity, minimize the next areas in Palestinian affected. I'm reminding you, or if this is breaking news, Clinton never presented a map, ever, in the process. He just laid out the parameters. Thankfully, I got a phone call from Shlomo Ben-Ami about 2 years ago and said, I'm writing a new book on the peace process. Could you please draw me a map reflecting the Clinton parameters? And we discussed 6% annexation, the maximum annexation, and 3% swap. And the result you can see up there on the screen behind me. The blue marks here are 6% annexation of the West Bank. I plagiarized the Geneva swap right next to Gaza and in a southwest of the West Bank. And as we'll see later, Geneva only swaps back 2.2% because the annexation is much more limited there. We'll talk about it in a moment. I had to add a little bit more territory, but I had also to play both sides. I could definitely go with a classic Israeli view. We would like the Palestinians to take just desert down south. It's not worth a lot, and go enjoy. But I had to kind of be fair with myself, and I said Palestinians would also look at the quality of the land. So I swapped some good farmland in the northeastern part of the Jordan Valley. And this is kind of the map that I got from that.
Excuse me.
Yes.
When you mentioned the security buffer in the Jordan Valley, is that purely for security buffer purposes, or is there a lot of economic, like hub or pipelines going through it, or the river or something like that?
If you ever seen the Jordan River, it is if you open the water in your tap down the road, there's more water than running through the river right now. It's a sad environmental thing that happens, actually drying up the Dead Sea down south. There are, to my knowledge, no serious infrastructure running through the Jordan Valley, and the economic situation alongside it of both Palestinian towns and Jewish settlements there, that are usually more agricultural in nature, is just sad. Most of them are bankrupt. If you drive through there, you'll see greenhouses that are run down, and it's just it's a dying treasure, if you would.
The Red to Dead plan?
The Red to Dead plan is another issue, but that has to do more with the southern part, connecting the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. It's a canal that Paris has been working on for a while now, and good luck to him, I guess. It's right. It doesn't have to do with the upper Jordan River Valley as we know it. Later, when I have the GS, I can also discuss that a little bit. Finally, the Taba negotiations of January 2001, in which Israel put down a map. And by the way, I got my hands on the authentic map that was used in the negotiations, I think, or I was told, and it looked like it, articulating 8% Israeli annexation, not drawing any lines for land swaps, but nonetheless, land swaps were discussed. Daniel could probably shed some light more on the Taba negotiations if you're interested. Then this is the map articulating again roughly 8% annexation that was put forth. Some lessons maybe from the past round as we look future. First of all, at no time any official proposal, not Israeli, not an American, explicitly referred to the 1967 lines. It was implied by calculating percentages out of something, and by the way, that's a whole issue by itself because it was never really defined, not even in the Clinton parameters, what actually figures into the percentages. Is Gaza in or out? Is the northwestern part of the Dead Sea in or out? Are the no man's lands in or out? And these alter the percentages a little bit, not by much. Nonetheless, no reference to the 1967 line explicit. And the 100% principle, meaning that for every inch that Israel annexes out of the West Bank, the agreement obviously, it will then compensate the future state of Palestine by swapping back land in equal amount, was never embraced to this process. I'm reminding you that the peace agreement with Egypt, in the peace agreement with Egypt, Israel we withdrew fully to the 67 lines. In the peace treaty with Jordan, we withdrew fully to a line similar to the 67 lines, except that over there we introduced border modifications. But again, swaps were 1 to 1%. Back then, and in that case, no localities, no settlements were involved in those swaps, mostly for agricultural and farming reasons. So the line was modified. But that principle, which is a core Arab political need, to be able to tell to their own people that Israel withdrew all the way to the line of 1967, or the equivalent of, that kind of magic bullet as far as the territorial element was never really hit on. Definitely not by Israeli proposals. Also, the American bridging proposals did not get there. I'm reminding you that the Clinton parameters talked about the equivalent of 97%. Where to from here? Here, I'm going to throw up, it takes about, a common sense, 10 minutes in front of a laptop to reach some sort of a formula that could have the basic principles that the side could agree on as they enter this round of negotiations. I'll let you read it a little bit. It talks about clear reference to 1967 lines, agreed upon modifications that include land swaps that are equal in size. Again, the 100% principle, the 1-to-1 ratio. And obviously they'll take into consideration party security and demographic interests. Again, you can then draw again on President Bush's statements about large Jewish population centers and about agreed upon that is up there. And you can get as creative as you want. Obviously, I'm not dictating anything to anybody. But if you look, this has a clear 1967 reference, which is a Palestinian need. It also has modifications built into it, which is an Israeli need to account for some or most large settlement blocks that are close to the Green Line. It talks about 1-to-1 swap, which is, again, a Palestinian need, the 100% concept. And finally, in here, there are no limitations on the size of the modifications and swap, which would probably satisfy an Israeli need. Israel would definitely not want to limit or will not agree to limit the modifications to roughly 2% of the West Bank. If we accept this principle, let's examine, if you would, the reserves that Israel have, or the bank of potential land swaps that Israel has, because this will dictate a lot of what future maps could look like. And there are several criteria that go here. First of all, land swaps will be bilateral. There's been a proposal out there about trilateral, if you would, mechanism that will involve Egypt. It will expand the spectrum of land swaps available. I won't discuss it here. If you really want, we'll get to it in later stages. Land swaps should be in close proximity to the Green Line. Sometimes people propose that Palestinians would accept some piece of desert kind of further away from the Gaza Strip. I don't think it's it's really realistic to expect Palestinians to accept it, but they have proposed it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, realistic land swap need to be attached to the West Bank or Gaza, the Green Line. Land swaps should probably stay away from Israel's narrow waist, and we'll look at that in the map in a moment. And finally, they should be probably consistent with major infrastructures on the one hand in Israel proper, and also consistent with settlement blocks. I mean, you don't want to swap land that is west of large settlement blocks that you want to annex. There are two unresolved issues in this regard. One is the relative value of this. Again, it's a Palestinian. Palestinians make that point that they don't only want the same size of land, but also want some sort of good land to be swapped. And finally, the idea of populated land swaps versus unpopulated land swaps. Most of the historic notion was about unpopulated land swaps, but recently Israeli Minister Avigdor Lieberman has promoted an idea that the swaps should also include some Israeli Arab towns that are in close proximity to the Green Line from within Israel proper, and we'll examine that shortly. Let's look at some maps. Again, this is the West Bank and Gaza. I'll take all the population in there off just for visual clarity. They're not gone, obviously. These are all the vast majority of the Israeli towns that surround the West Bank and surround Gaza. I will leave just those that are relatively close proximity to the West Bank. Let's look at land swaps options. First of all, is land swap high in good agricultural land right next to Gaza, and you can see the darker green is of higher quality land again next to Gaza and up here, and then some medium quality, if you would, land around the southern western part, I guess, of the West Bank. I'll add to that, low quality land that is in desert. Again, all these are unpopulated. And this is roughly everything Israel can put on the table as far as unpopulated land swaps are concerned. We're talking about between 3 and 4% of land that is, or the equivalent of 3 or 4% of the West Bank land that could reasonably be swapped into Palestine, that is of high quality and medium quality, and the rest, again, roughly 3 or 4% of just desert. And again, you can swap back even more desert if you'd like to think so, but I think Palestinians would not accept that in return for, Ariel, Ma'ale Adumim, whatever big settlements Israel would like to annex. So this is kind of the bank. There's not a whole lot of room to maneuver here. And then again, the up in the northwest, the idea to swap populated areas that have Israeli Arabs with them, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's look at some scenarios or models for borders. If we accept the 100% principle, you'll see 3 maps now. The first one will be a map of the Geneva Initiative that articulates 2.2% annexation and equivalent 2.2% swap. Then I'll show you a map of Israel's barrier, again, almost 9% annexation, and I took the liberty to add some land swaps and to see what that looks like. Finally, a sort of a bridging proposal that is based on the line that the Council for Peace and Security, the same NGO that Daniel introduced in the beginning, they put forth a line or an alternative trajectory for Israel's barrier. It calls for roughly 5.5% of the West Bank to remain on the Israeli side. And again, I took the liberty to take their line and add land swaps to them. And just a little note, these maps are very accurate, but they're not authoritative. Obviously, they're not sanctioned by any of the parties, except for maybe Geneva. But, if not, Daniel can just come here and unplug me. Okay, this is a map along the Geneva Initiative. As you can see, the annexation is quite limited in geographic scope, but fortunately, most of the Jews that reside beyond the Green Line, both in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, roughly 75% of them reside within these 2.5% that Israel, could ask to annex in the context of an agreement. So that makes the job of having to relocate settlers much easier. If there are 450,000 Jews that reside beyond the Green Line, 270,000 of them in the West Bank, and roughly 180,000 of them in East Jerusalem, it'll be very difficult for Israel to remove all of those. But if we could change the border just by a little bit, like they did in Geneva, we decrease that number to 120,000 Israelis that are left on the Palestinian side and are slated for evacuation in this. And we'll see a table with all that data.
Are we going to look more closely at a map of Jerusalem and a specific?
Yes, I promise. Don't let me leave the room if we don't do that. Again, a safe passage is articulated here. Here's a map of the of annexation along the trajectory of the barrier. As you can see, large settlement blocks, roughly 8.5 to 9% annexation. And again, I took the liberty to add land swaps, and I'm reminding you that most of these land swaps are just desert, or at least half of them is just desert. I don't think this is a realistic map for final status options, but nonetheless, it is something that negotiators can toy with. Finally, the sort of a bridging proposal wasn't put forth as a bridging proposal, but I plagiarized and I use it as a bridging proposal, articulating roughly 5.5% annexation, and as you can see, the respective land swap as narrower than the land swap with that has to do with a barrier. This is just to give you, obviously, these maps are not there for them to take it or leave them, but they kind of give them a sense that this is doable. If you embrace the concept of 100%, you can actually reach lines and maps that allow you to work with, especially if right now you're only aiming at a principle. Okay. Same maps, and we found this very effective as you deal with Israeli decision makers, because the other view is it's not distorted, but it's very threatening for Israel, for us Israelis. You see a large threatening West Bank and a very narrow Israel on the left. This view gives Israelis a much more a greater sense of comfort, if you would. The lines of Geneva, as you can see, very small modifications. Lines of the barrier, a little bigger modifications, and finally a bridging proposal. And this is here just for kind of reference and a different view of things.
Do you have the numbers of how many people you have to evacuate under each of the 3
Right. What you see here is a table articulating the numbers of
No more planted questions.
of different. Don't go through. Don't try and read it all. First of all, it's in small print, and secondly, I'll highlight the important stuff. On the left, you see demographic data, and on the right, you see geographic data. And you reporters that really want to, I'll be happy to zip you some of this information via email. So you can look. On the left, you see the different scenarios. Green line meaning the entire West Bank, barrier, the bridge, the Council for Peace and Security line, and Geneva. If you look at Israelis that are left on the Palestinian side, this is what you asked. In the barrier calls for evacuation of almost 65,000 Israelis. Council for Peace and Security is 75,000 Israelis that are left again on the Palestinian side, and in Geneva roughly 125,000 of those. I also draw your attention to how many Palestinians are left on the Israeli side. The barrier as is today, because it cuts out East Jerusalem or follows the municipal boundary of East Jerusalem and keeps on the Israeli side all or most of the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, has a bloated number of 230,000 Palestinians that are left on the Israeli side. Obviously, this is not a formula for a peace agreement, because there will need to be some changes or serious changes in the lines in and around Jerusalem. Nonetheless, these are the numbers of the barrier. The Council for Peace and Security line.
Well, presumably the vast majority of that 235,000 is Jerusalem.
Correct. Roughly 200,000 of those in Jerusalem and the rest in the West Bank. Council for Peace and Security line, you see that number drop significantly because it divides Jerusalem, for the most part, along demographic lines. And Geneva, if you would, we have total separation between Palestinians and Israelis without a single Palestinian left on the Israeli side.
We don't
Yes.
forcibly annex Palestinians to Israel.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was just wondering, this is a big question, but I was
Sure.
wondering if you could say just a few words about the type of settlers. In other words, some of course, went for economic reasons.
Right.
Some went for religious reasons.
Right.
Within that data, can
Mm-hmm.
you differentiate who is who here?
Not in this table, but I'll tell you this. In any scenario, even the scenario in any scenario that calls for any evacuation of settlements, okay, even a very pro-settler agenda that calls for a minimal evacuation of, let's say, just 10 or 20,000 settlers, you will have to remove those settlements that are in the heart of the West Bank. And those are the most ideological, the most religious settlements, if you would. So actually, the tough images of resistance and for both political and ideological reasons, you will see regardless of whatever scenario you're tackling. Because the discussion is exactly how much land you're going to annex in the big settlement blocks that are in close proximity to the Green Line, those settlers are for the most part not ideological as much. You see a lot of either secular settlements there, like Ariel, for example, that is not that close to the Green Line, but it's a good example. Or you see ultra-Orthodox settlements like Modi'in Elite and Beitar Elite, and I'll show them on the map in a moment. These are kind of like the biggest settlements. And so you don't see the hardcore ideological settlers there. One major exception to that is the Gush Etzion area that is in close proximity to the Green Line and has, a lot of ideology attached to it and history as well. I'll show you a little bit more as we finish with the PowerPoint.
Yes. Is there a way to turn down the AC? We're getting a chill on this side of the room.
Cool. Let me talk a little bit, just because this was not part of my original presentation, but it has come up again and again and again this week. And again, the idea of populated land swaps is the idea proposed by Avigdor Lieberman, or promoted by Avigdor Lieberman. There were others that thought about it earlier. It basically says Israeli Arabs who are despite them being full Israeli citizens, should probably join their brothers in the West Bank in the context of land swaps. They don't like Israel as a Jewish state anyways, and their loyalty is in question. Why don't we just, we don't even have to move them out of their homes. We can just draw the line around their homes, and they will become part of the Palestinian state. Now, I'm going to take all the moral and legal issues, and I'm going to throw them out the window. Okay, even though I have very strong opinions about this, what it says about Israel as a democracy and how it treats its own citizens, how we treat our own citizens. Just for the sake of this discussion, in geographical and demographical terms, I'm going to just throw it out the window. Here you can see all the same, Israeli localities that are in close proximity to the Green Line from within Israel, and here you see them divided between those that are Jewish localities in blue and those that are green localities, Arab localities in green. Let's look at some stuff that will influence how much Israeli Arabs we can swap. There are roughly, before I do that, there are roughly 240,000 Israeli Arabs that reside in close proximity to the Green Line. If I throw up here the major infrastructure that's in Israel, road number 6, Trans-Israel Road, that connects southern Israel with northern Israel, is the only toll road that we have in Israel, and we're still struggling with that notion to an extent. But it's a major artery. I think it's unrealistic to expect that Israel would offer to swap anything west of it. Another issue to be reckoned with is the large settlement blocks, again here articulated by the security barrier. A place like Kafr Qasim down here, as you follow my cursor, who could be swapped theoretically, is probably not going to be put on the table because it is west of a large settlement block, the Ariel block. One exception to this is this little block here of two small settlements called Shaked and Rechan. They're relatively small in size, and this block that is currently surrounded by the security barrier could probably be scratched in the context of a final status agreement. This brings us to what is actually realistic as far as populated land swaps. And again, all moral and legal issues are out the window, and not that they're not important, I'm just not going to deal with them right now. And you can find great analysis online on this issue. But if you look at what's realistic, you're talking about you're talking about between 100 and 140,000 of Israeli Arabs that could theoretically be swapped into the state of Palestine. And if you consider the 1.2 million Israeli Arabs in Israel, you'll see that you at most reach 10% of those. This does not resolve any demographic problem like Avigdor Lieberman would try to portray. It barely puts a little dent in the numbers that will be overcome again in the course of the next 10, 15 years. When we confronted Lieberman's people with this analysis, they remained silent. I mean, that proposal is largely, kind of vague when they talk about it. I think it's unrealistic proposal as far as bilateral agreement between Israel and Palestine. That is not to mention that the Israeli Arabs are obviously do not support such a concept, nor do the Palestinians, the PLO. Okay, briefly, Jerusalem. The classic Israeli position on Jerusalem. Again, you see here the municipal boundary of Jerusalem, as again Israel declared unilaterally in 1967. You see here the trajectory of the barrier that Israel is building. Actually, this is a better view because it differentiates between what's already built that you can see in red and what's just planned that you can see in purple, pink. Pink is the right color, I guess. As you can see, the large bubble around Ma'ale Adumim and the large area annexing the Gush Etzion block is actually pending both Supreme Court decisions, and Dorit Beinish, our Chief Justice, I guess you call her, is that right? Our Chief Justice would have been sitting on this for the past 8 months, not handing down decisions, because she would very much, this is my assessment, she would very much like the politics of this to play out and determine the fate of the big blocks. As you can see, Israel built the in this case it's actual physical wall, for the most part around the municipal boundary of Jerusalem, cutting off East Jerusalem from its West Bank surroundings, and the humanitarian problems that have resulted, that evolved on the ground have been well documented in the press, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Israel is aware that this is not a formula for a solution as far as the Palestinians, so I took the liberty here to adopt the Council for Peace and Security line a little bit. But please ignore the size of the settlement blocks around it or the way they're annexed. I'm just using existing lines. So, you can imagine the Ma'ale Adumim bubble being bigger or smaller. Just ignore it for now. Focus on what's left of East Jerusalem. And this is what I call the Ramon plan. It is Chaim Ramon, who proposed to transfer some Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem to the Palestinians, in the context of a political process. And as you can see, if you see in the background this finger, part of the Jerusalem municipal boundary, these neighborhoods of Beit Hanina and Shuafat are left on the Palestinian side, and again in the southeast, Tzolbacher, Jabal Mukaber, and other neighborhoods. This roughly helps the demographic balance inside Jerusalem toward a stronger Jewish majority. It roughly cuts out, if you would, 100,000 Palestinians in Arab neighborhoods. What it does not address, though, it does not address the area of the old city, its close proximity to the historic basin, and this line also leaves the next urban belt of Palestinian neighborhoods, Ras El Amud, Sheikh Jarrah, and others, Atur, and others, maintaining another 100,000 Palestinians on the Israeli side of it. This is basically letting go of what we Israelis don't want anyways, all those 100,000 Palestinians that take up Social Security because they're permanent residents of Israel, etc., etc., etc. And we keep, the heart of East Jerusalem. This is roughly what this plan
Is this the Jerusalem component of the 5.7% so-called bridging council?
No. Actually, I plagiarized a little bit. I took the Council for Peace and Security line, which we'll see here in a moment, how it deals with Jerusalem, and I added this heart of Jerusalem idea that will remain on the Israeli side of it. Good question. What could we expect Israel to put on the table, if you would, or to demand in this round of negotiations? Jewish parts and the urban center of Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty. This is more of an interest, again, tilting the demographic balance toward a stronger Jewish majority. The holy places with some sort of special arrangements for Christians and Muslims will remain under Israeli sovereignty. And finally, the notion of hard borders throughout the Jerusalem area is definitely an Israeli interest and will be an Israeli demand. Not for the hard borders to be necessarily embedded in the statement of principles or the agreement, but the option for Israel to erect physical barriers that will separate between itself and the Palestinian state is definitely a notion we cannot live, we Israelis, who are concerned about our security. At least right now, I don't believe we can leave a hole as big as the entire municipal area of Jerusalem for unmonitored access between Palestine and Israel. This will render the rest of the hard borders just useless. And we'll look about that. We'll look at that in a moment, in a second. I believe that the Palestinian position could best be articulated by actually examining the Geneva Agreement, the Geneva Initiative. And again, please ignore the size of the annexation outside Jerusalem. Again, I'm using existing lines, so I didn't just draw my own lines. But as you can see here, in Geneva, the demographic division, or the division along demographic lines within Jerusalem is complete.
And I just have to say,
Sure.
to do justice,
Mhm.
the one thing our Palestinian negotiating partners always said is, you're going to use this and claim it's the Palestinian position. Geneva Initiative is a Palestinian effort to accommodate the Israeli position. The Palestinian position is the 67 line. The Geneva Initiative is, if you Israelis insist on maintaining some of the illegal things that contravene international law that you've done since 67, we'll, for the sake of the two-state solution, try and accommodate you. This is our effort to accommodate you.
Perfectly fine.
Sorry.
No, you're right in a sense. This is more of an attempt to try and game out where Palestinians, how far Palestinians could go to accommodate or to try and reach an agreement. So I perfectly take your comment, and I will modify this PowerPoint after this. But nonetheless, the division of along demographic lines in Geneva is along the lines of the Geneva Agreement is complete, and actually the difference here, I believe, between the Palestinian position and Israeli demands is actually in the old city and its close surroundings. And when I switch to the JS, we can dive in there. But Palestinians always demanded, and for in their defense, they say we need sovereignty over the Haram and all non-Jewish parts of the old city, at least. Again, their position historically has been entire old city. They would accommodate, in Geneva at least, they did accommodate Israeli needs as far as Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish quarter and the Wailing Wall. So the division of Jerusalem also dives into the old city and the historic basin, like was articulated in the Clinton parameters of 2000. And Geneva adopted that for the most part. Where could agreement, I think, be reached? As the Palestinians look for definitely a capital in all the Arab parts of East Jerusalem, sovereignty over the Haram and non-Jewish parts of the old city. The Palestinians also very much like the notion that has a sense of openness in it. Where do I see a possible points of agreement? At least as we look at Annapolis, or something that will follow immediately after, as far as a formula for, again, some sort of a principle for agreement on Jerusalem, which will articulate Jewish neighborhoods under Israeli sovereignty, Arab neighborhoods under Palestinian sovereignty, with special regime or special arrangement. And I don't think a statement of principles should probably dive into more than that right now, and allow the thorough negotiation process to kind of pour in the details of those special arrangements or special regime in there. Demarcation along distinct demographic lines is I should probably change it. It is both an Israeli and Palestinian, if you would. They get sort of what they want in there. Special arrangements for the historic basin, again, both get freedom of access and whatever administration or worship practices will be applied there should satisfy the religious needs as far as practice is concerned of both parties, but none of them would probably get the sovereignty they so desperately are asking for, at least initially, on the Haram Temple Mount area. And finally, no limitation on the nature of borders, at least outside the old city and its close surroundings. And again, here this is what negotiators can toy with. One, again, is Geneva. It divides Jerusalem along distinct demographic lines, and also within the old city and its close surroundings. Here is, for example, the real line of the Council for Peace and Security that also divides Jerusalem along demographic lines almost entirely. It could probably be changed in the context of a peace agreement. And here the entire historic basin is colored so that you could imagine with me a special regime or some sort of special arrangements there.
How does a Palestinian get from Ramallah to Bethlehem?
In this regard, it will, I'm done with this. Let's dive right into that using the GIS. Okay? I will switch over quickly to the GIS. A quick introduction to the tool. I'll zoom in here, toward the West Bank. Let's throw up again the municipal boundary of Jerusalem, and in blue are Israeli settlements, in green are Palestinian localities. Why don't I just to introduce this tool, and I love this tool, it's very easy. Let's, for example, take the settlement of Neve Daniel down in Gush Etzion, and I'll zoom down to it. So you don't really need to know the area. All you got to do is point your cursor, and it'll tell you exactly where you are. I'll take the green out of the background, and we have here aerial photography of the entire West Bank and Gaza, and I'll give it a second to load. And as you can see here, we can really zoom in using this tool to look at things at the micro level. We can then zoom out and look at things at the macro level. By the way, you can see some construction here that's taking place for an expansion a little bit more toward this. I'm showing you this to show you a couple of things. First of all, we can click on the settlement itself, and we see relevant data that we've gathered, taking on or building on the relevant Central Bureau of Stats. Neve Daniel is a settlement that was established in 1982, and since 1990 you can actually trace down its population growth. It has roughly 1,700 people today. It is a religious
At
community.
the start of the Oslo process,
Mhm.
you have 491.
Correct.
And today you have 1,700.
Correct. Just in Neve Daniel. It is a religious community, and again, we can attach whatever data is relevant, whatever other data is relevant to this. So it's a pretty cool tool that we have. I'll zoom a little bit out. I need a green line and probably also a coastline. I'll put this in the background again, just for visual clarity. You mind if I also cover E1 as I cover the north-south connection? Okay. Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, if you would. Let's look at E1. What you see here in lighter blue is the area known as E1. It's a construction plan that we Israelis had since, I guess, the early 90s. It calls for roughly 3,500 residential units and other tourist hotels, all kinds of services, etc. Because of international pressure, it has been frozen, and you can really see why here, because it drives a serious nail in between the north-south connection of the of West Bank. If I'll throw up here the trajectory of the Israeli barrier, and again, what I will do is I'll show you the status of it. Again, whatever's in red is built, whatever's in pink is just projected. And I actually would like this to be a little lighter so we can see better what's under this.
Do you use pink when you're not doing the presentation in pink?
I've lived here for 5 years. I have loyalty to this. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And okay, so here's the trajectory of the barrier. And traditionally, let's see here. Where's my road layer? Can anybody figure out? Here it is. I'm going to pull it up so we can see it clearly. And you don't have to follow all my technical things, you know. Some of us get a kick out of it, others much less. Traditionally, Palestinians used to go from Ramallah from Bethlehem through Jerusalem along what we Israelis call Road 1, Palestinians call Road 60. Along came Oslo. With it, not because of it, but with it, came suicide bombings at a later stage, and Israel started putting checkpoints for our security reasons up here in the northern part of Jerusalem and in the southern part of Jerusalem. Later came the collapse of the peace process, Intifada, even more suicide bombing, and we started building a physical barrier. And we diverted Palestinian movement to what's known as the Wadi Nar Road. The Wadi Nar Road goes to the east of Jerusalem. It actually, as you can see, the barrier the construction is finished along this area. So Palestinians actually join what is a joint Israeli and Palestinian road right now toward Jericho. Then they then veer to the left and up to Ramallah. Obviously, there are checkpoints there, and these are well documented both in press. And if you need more information about checkpoints, visit OCHA's website. But
The Office of
Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They have the most thorough data on checkpoints and access and movement. When Israelis, we always ask the Ministry of Defense, and the international community has always asked the Ministry of Defense, what is the scheme by which Palestinians get from the southern West Bank to the northern West Bank for a more if you would, permanent or long-term solution, because the Wadi Nar road is a rundown road, and it takes a lot of time to get north to south. So after a lot of deliberation, Israel has started building parts of an Israeli, it's a traditional Israeli plan called the Eastern Ring Road. Its origins are in trying to connect the northern neighborhoods of Jerusalem, okay, and the continuation of Road 443. It's a major artery that connects the Tel Aviv area to Jerusalem. It cuts through the West Bank here, and then it would have connected to the Eastern Ring Road and allow it to get to Jewish neighborhoods in southern Jerusalem. In relative ease. Parts of this have now been constructed, and what I'll do, I will zoom in here on this kind of bottleneck. And I'm sorry if this gets a little crowded. What I'll do is I'll take the roads out, and I will take Jerusalem's municipal boundary out, which is this purple line. Okay. Oh, I need E1. Here we go. Right here. And in the background, I will throw on the ortho. And as you will see, the ortho being the aerial photography, and as you will see, Israel is actually, we're constructing part of the Eastern Ring Road, which you can see here. And if I zoom in closer, you can see that that road is actually divided in half by a wall. You can see the wall running down the middle of it, right there and right there. Why don't I take the blue out of the background so we can see even easier? Okay, you can see the road is being constructed now and is divided in half. Half of it will be for Israeli use with entrances to Jerusalem. Half of it will be for Palestinian use without entrances to Jerusalem, just so they can go north and south along this area. By the way, Daniel, this is how, there'll be an X in movement or a crossing in movement in any scheme. Both Geneva has a very narrow umbilical cord, if you would. The major highway that leads from the heart of Jerusalem toward Ma'ale Adumim is under Israeli sovereignty, and Palestinians would have to go over or under it as well. The real question is the size of that artery that connects Ma'ale Adumim. And one option, again, is some sort of an architectural design for this area to allow movement of Palestinians. I am not saying that solutions should be dictated by architectural or planning designs, but those should be probably utilized after finalized lines have been agreed upon. Let me zoom out very quickly. Recently in the news, recently in the news you heard about a new confiscation orders that Israel has handed down to Palestinians in Abu Dis, and that is because, where's my roads? Nice. Because even this scheme, the part of the Eastern Ring Road, still channels Palestinian movement north and south, west of E1 and west of Ma'ale Adumim, and we Israelis don't like it, obviously. Our, if you would, wet dream would be for Palestinians to go around the big bubble. So just accidentally, the new confiscation orders for the road follow almost exactly the trajectory of the barrier. And this is just the initiation. Obviously, this road is for Palestinian use. It has been promoted as such or PR'd as such by by our Ministry of Defense. And if I throw up here, just as a last point,
They have started construction in E1.
just a police station, yes.
That's how it starts.
That's usually how it
A
starts.
cell phone tower.
Although when we talk to Israeli officials, they understand that this, definitely for the time being, will be the end of it. If nothing else, the U.S. has been consistent in its pressure on Israel to stop, not to build in E1. And police stations are always are part of what Israel refers to as a security mechanism, and these are usually perceived as not prejudging final status, unlike residential units. So I'm going to stop here, and I guess open it for your comments, Daniel, and then for questions.
More to open it up to you. Well, I'll just say I think it's you've done a fantastic service, Dan, by putting this together and presenting this to us this morning. I understand that you're going to turn this into a PDF version that we will certainly put up on the New America website and the link to this event once that's ready. I'll put it on my blog. Americans for Peace Now are going to have it up, and I imagine others will too. I mean, really, this is the kind of serious work that I wish the negotiating teams that we're meeting were looking at. Maybe one thing, because you mentioned it in passing, and the first in what again it's going to be a short series of events we did earlier this week with Mustafa Barghouti, and people may remember that Mustafa showed those those maps of the shrinking Palestine. One of the things, and you mentioned it in passing, Dan, is this Gaza West Bank link. And I know that there's a position that says, well, in the land trade-off, the corridor between Gaza and the West Bank shouldn't be worth the measly few kilometers that it is, but this would be worth 1, 3, 5, whatever percent. Because I think when you look at how do you do a land swap, you excluded that. And I think you were right to. And I think your earlier maps showed why you were right to. And I think this is what gets to the nub of it for me is the only reason there's going to be a bifurcated Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and you need a link between the West Bank and Gaza, is that we're basing this on 49 and not on 47. Israel won the argument about the state of Israel being on 78% of the land, rather than on 55% of the land, which is what the UN recommended in Resolution 181, which Dan showed us. For me, as an Israeli, the challenge is whether Israelis can kind of take yes for an answer and accept that you've got recognition on 78%. So I just think that the need for that entire connection is because you're now talking about an agreement predicated on 78-22. I don't want to make any more comments because in the time remaining, I'd like really to open it up to people here to ask questions and you know, if you want to go into any more detail on anything Dan raised. So if people just identify themselves or not, as the case may be, please.
Had you had those instruments in the past, your term at the conference, that have actually helped the atmosphere or the way to talk to each other?
No, I think it's a question of political will.
So it was not a failure of imagination or something like that. It was really, they knew what they were talking about. Seeing these really complicated borders, sometimes
I think there's something to that. But if you're looking to be creative and to solve problems, I mean, it's the difference between, and it's kind of where I butted in. It's if the negotiating positions are from the Palestinian side, everything you've done since 1967 is illegal, is against international law. Full stop. There's no negotiation, really, because the Israelis aren't going to withdraw 450, 370,000. If it's everything you've done is illegal, is against international law, full stop, right, now we've got to make an agreement with you. Don't talk to us about the security or about anything else. Talk to us about how you accommodate our needs if we're going to accommodate your needs. And likewise on the Israeli side. If it's not about saying, look, we're going to justify for you why we've got the settlements here. Forget all of that. There's a political need here. As any Israeli leader, I can't sell to my public evacuating 470,000 people. How many of these people can you give me? And then when you start drawing lines that aren't about bringing in people, that are about controlling vast swathes of unpopulated territory, then the Palestinians say, whoa, now you're taking the piss. Now you're not being serious. And so that, I think Dan really helped highlight how you can draw lines that somehow converge on something that is marketable, palatable to an Israeli public and likewise to a Palestinian public. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Can I just,
please.
When President Clinton saw this, he said, the result would probably have been the same, but the process would have been a lot easier to get there. He also mentioned that when you sit at the same side in front of the computer, it creates a different dynamic than if you fight with each other alone. I mean, when you fight alongside each other, and the problem is right here ahead of you, this is what he said, it creates a different dynamic around the table. So whatever is that worth?
I mean, there is something, that's absolutely right, because we use these were the tools we used in Geneva, much less than having pieces of paper and maps with thick pens on a table. So I think it's a very fair point you raised. Please, sir.
Yeah, Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. My conclusion after seeing this, and maybe you share it, is that I don't think any of us could pass a test on the possible permutations or options. And that's why those of us, some of us, that have followed this issue for decades, think that Annapolis won't happen. There's no Israeli consensus on even discussing final status issues. The default position still is to take land. It was 6% expansion in 2006, probably the same this year. There's no U.S. leverage. I don't think anyone believes that. And most important, there's no authoritative or responsible Palestinian authority that can implement whatever is agreed upon. As Richard Haas would say, the situation's not ripe for resolution. Who is optimistic about Annapolis?
When you started to do what you said, I said to myself that I failed. I mean, if after looking at this, you couldn't really get a sense of why agreement could be reached, then I said I failed. But luckily, when you start explaining,
I think you were brilliant on looking
no,
at the
when
options.
you started explaining, then I understood that you were talking more about the politics
Yes.
of Annapolis. And I'm so happy to have Daniel here who can probably answer that better, because I'm just good with maps. The politics of it, are different.
No, I think there's a lot to what you say. I think John Alterman at CSIS wrote what I thought was a very insightful piece in the FT yesterday or the day before, where he says Palestinians and Israelis need to have serious discussions amongst themselves. There was an Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, in the 1960s, who talked about Israel playing chess with itself. And I think only when you've got an Israeli side that's sitting down with Dan and saying, okay, give me all the permutations between 2 and 6%, and what can I, then you'll know we're ready we're preparing ourselves to play chess with the other side. Unfortunately, when our Prime Minister is sending the Secretary of State to meet with the leader of the Shas Party and the leader of Israel-Palestine, so she can hear just how inflexible they are and how boxed in he is, then we're still playing chess with ourselves. I mean, Olmert's got to decide, is he negotiating with Lieberman or is he negotiating with a Palestinian, which Lieberman is not, for those of you not familiar with our Minister for Strategic Threats. He's a Moldovan, but that's another story. So, personally, I think Olmert is closer to this, to taking a serious position. I actually think if Olmert gets some traction and rehabilitates himself politically, then he has a much more sensible, realistic, opening negotiating position and negotiating strategy than Ehud Barak did. I think one of the huge mistakes of the Barak effort was to turn this into a souk, a market bazaar-like negotiation. So Barak, as you said, goes from 65 to 70 to 77 to, in one version, 88, or was it really 88? Because what was happening with the Jordan Valley? Rather than sitting and saying, here are my interests, here's what I can market domestically, politically, what can you do? How do we work this through? How do we resolve a problem? I think Olmert is much more along that track. He's much more of a realist. I think he's gone a lot further.
But can he deliver?
Well, I'm saying there's a question here of his need to politically rehabilitate himself. I think on the Israeli side, you find out when you push the envelope. That, for me, is the historical lesson. You didn't know. I mean, Rabin, albeit had a very different Knesset, but he didn't know whether there would be members of the Likud, as there were, who abstained in crucial votes, or a religious party like Shas that didn't bring him down over crucial votes during Oslo. But Rabin was the one who decided. I think Rabin could have gone back and forth to the rabbi and to potential Likud rebels endlessly. He could only find out when he took the risk, and he had the courage to take the risk. Now, Barak went to Camp David, and this is an interesting difference with Olmert. Barak went to Camp David with a minority coalition of 30 members of Knesset out of 120. He'd already totally lost his coalition, mainly due to incompetent political management, less due to the substance here. Olmert is going to go to Annapolis still with, not only with a coalition intact, but also with an interesting Knesset that under certain circumstances can give him a majority for far-reaching progress. The makeup of the Knesset today, interestingly, is probably more prone to territorial compromise, definitely than the Knesset that preceded it, and than the Knesset under Barak. Mainly because this phenomenon of Kadima, there may be Kadima rebels who would go against a serious deal, but the phenomenon of Kadima is essentially the center of the Israeli political map, saying we are ready for on the Palestinian side, I think we made terrible mistakes with the national unity government. On the Palestinian side, I think that the problem is if anything more dramatic, mainly because we've done everything to discourage the wing of Hamas that was ready to work through a political process internally in Palestine and ultimately to authorize Abbas to negotiate with Israel. I think we've encouraged the people in Hamas who rejected the political process. We continue to encourage the most hardline tendencies in Hamas, and there's no sign of that ending. And to be honest, if whatever the outcome of Annapolis is, success or less so, it encourages internal Palestinian reconciliation, then I'd almost say dayenu. Then I'd say that's a success in itself, even if that's not intended. On the American side, I think there is a leverage which Dan referred to. The American broker or whatever has proved not effective at saying this is what you guys need to do to reach a deal. Clinton claimed closest to saying it. The American side has, though, proven when it wants to that it can be quite a good block against harm being done. E1 being a good example. And I, you know, without giving away state secrets, having worked in government, I know what the effect is when there is an American full court press against something bad happening. A preventive engagement has historically, when it's been applied, been effective. It's kind of difficult to say that when we're 470,000 settlers later in the story. But when they've woken up and got engaged preventively, I think that. But I don't want to hold this, and I want people to be able to ask Dan stuff. So I apologise for going on. Please.
Well, what precisely could or should the United States be doing to engage with Hamas or to mediate some sort of PLO Hamas reconciliation or whatever? I don't know.
Stay out. Do no harm. I mean, I think I'm not.
Well,
I'm
saying
definitely.
we're
I'm
doing
definitely.
things that are harming the process, so that thing should do nothing.
Well, I mean, on the particular issue that you addressed of Palestinian, the internal Palestinian politics, Hamas won an election. Everyone signed up to 3 ridiculous preconditions. Ridiculous because they were designed to fail. Of the recognize Israel's right to exist, previous agreements and violence. We could have focused on one of those first, at least. We could have made this staggered. We could have done what I grew up with in Israel, which is, well, I didn't grow up in Israel, but since I've been there, which is let's judge the Arabs by what they do, not what they say. And I think if you'd have made a ceasefire, suspension of violence, the key criteria at the beginning when Hamas came into government, you could be in a very different place today. Of course, that would have had to have been reciprocal. Rather than doing that, 3 conditions were applied. By the way, we never said anything to Hamas about how they govern Palestine. So we treated the Palestinians purely as a derivative of the Israeli question. We never said to Hamas in power, oh, and there's a 4th condition, maintain democratic process, rule of law, and some kind of equality for women or something like that. We never said any of those things. The Palestinians existed exclusively as a derivative of the conflict with Israel. So, then there was a boycott. Once there was a unity government, there was an attempt to arm one faction within one side, and anyone can read the history of what happened there. So on the Palestinian internal equation, let the Palestinians work through their own problems, and if they come to an arrangement which says Hamas will accept Abbas as a negotiating partner, I think that would be a much better way. I worry, my reading, and I'm in favor of the American Congress appropriating monies for aid to the PA, and there's a supplemental budget, and anyone who wants more details on it can read about it on the Americans for Peace Now website. There's a supplemental budget of direct American budgetary assistance being proposed for the PA, which is unusual, and it comes to about $150 million. Unfortunately, I have to say my take on this is that the Americans are basically saying to Abbas, listen, we ain't going to be able to deliver much for you at Annapolis on the political track, so here's some money just to make sure you don't go back to talking to Hamas. Maybe that's too cynical, but unfortunately I don't think so. Please.
Maps versus aerial photography. Do you find that one is more effective at reaching your audience than the other?
Reaching audience?
Reaching the audience and making when do people sort of go, oh, I didn't see it?
Well, there's a lot to this. Never been asked this question. I'll tell you this. When Sharon saw this, or something like this, I didn't present an agenda. I presented a tool more to him. It was early 2005. At the end, he said, but why are the Palestinians in such a passive greenish color? They should be in threatening red. And it's very telling. The real effect, it's kind of like a built-up effect. It's the colors of the maps that you use, the colors of the people, and how the transition goes from one to another that can, hopefully I was able to articulate kind of a sense of, yes, there's a complex problem here, but it is not beyond the ability of people to resolve. Definitely not this issue. So hopefully I used good enough colors for the general maps, and when we zoom in, you bring in the aerial photography to give a people sense of what's on the ground, because unfortunately I can't take you there. I would if I could, because there's nothing like being there to know. But you have to work with both to have a maximum effect on people.
Those darn pastel-colored Palestinians.
Could you say what percent of land that would be swapped would be, as you put it, good land or average land?
No more than 3% is of high quality, and you can stretch it up maybe toward the 4% if you had some so-so. So what I'm hinting at, that I believe that the final borders eventually would look much closer to Geneva than to the barrier. And with minor adjustment to Geneva, they got it right on.
Joel and then Ricky.
I really enjoyed the maps and presentation. The best I've seen.
Thank you.
Over the years. But I have one problem about the technician aspect. Something that Daniel refers to, and that is that ignores, in some respects, the discourse of occupation and the discourse of control. At a certain level, we Israelis start talking about what we're prepared to give up, as if we own it and we have the right to it. And it's very difficult, and that's a problem when we start sort of negotiating margins amongst ourselves. But I just wanted to pick up that aspect about what you said, about the think that the final map will look closer to Geneva, and to bring you back to, I think, the question which was asked during your presentation about what are these settlers and areas, because what Geneva ignores and what you just ignores is the issue of Ariel. And that brings in that 5.7% of the Council of Security. That changes the whole dynamics about the political possibilities of the Ariel. Maybe you need to explain to others about what the difficulties about that would involve and how that changes the dynamics of sort of swapping. Because it goes back into this question, can we just swap or do we accept that we're actually occupying land?
You ask one question and I'll answer three questions. First of all, this is the Ariel block, as you see here by the line of the Council for Peace and Security that does bring it in. Two things. First of all, let me talk about settlement freeze, and you'll see how I get to this.
The red line versus the blue?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Caught. The red line is designated as road protection. It is a term devised by the Ministry of Defense in how you address road connections that are deep inside Palestinian territory. And what it actually means is the Palestinians should have unimpeded access from, from both sides of that road. It's a different lecture of the nature of the barrier in different areas. I'll hold off on that for a moment. There's no such thing as settlement freeze. And as the sides go to Annapolis, a settlement either lives, by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean it expands. It could also go down in numbers, like some settlements have, or it could freeze, like Ariel. Ariel has had, let me press here, click this button, and you'll see, Ariel, for the past, since roughly 2001, have been relatively stable at around 16,000 people. A settlement either lives or it is designated to evacuation. One of the two. There's no such thing as a settlement freeze. A settlement is frozen because of life on the ground, not because Condi Rice said it should. As a note. As far as Ariel, who's been, a settlement in freeze for the most part, at some point an Israeli general will stand up and say, you know what? Sending Israeli sovereignty deep inside the West Bank in a line like this, in a narrow finger like this, is madness from a security perspective. And I think Amnon Shachak was one of the first ones, I think, to come on board on that, who was Israeli chief of staff. And, most people who want to keep Ariel doesn't really know where it is, 20 kilometers inside the West Bank. And, if the sides, I'm not here to dictate lines. If the sides agree that they accept Ariel, fine. But, it also decreases the numbers of Israelis you have to evacuate. But that is its only merit, as far as I'm concerned.
No, I mean, to echo what Dan said, when we were doing the Geneva Initiative, kind of full of trepidation, went off to see this former chief of staff of the IDF, Amnon Lipkin-Chuk, and said, look, in the negotiations, we're probably not going to keep Ariel. And he would say, well, my precondition for joining this effort is if we don't fight to keep Ariel, because I think it's the biggest security headache for Israel, to have a finger 20 kilometers deep. And the former head of the Central Command, who went into Labour Party politics, Mitzner, said the same. And I think, Joel, that's... I almost think the difference between the Geneva position, in terms of what Israel takes at least, and Olmert, is the Ariel finger.
It's a solid political issue. I mean, it's one thing having former
that's true.
generals come to that conclusion.
I think it's true.
When you look at the heartland of Ariel politics, engagement with the party,
It's not. Look, as Dan said, it's not inconceivable that the Palestinians. It's not totally inconceivable. I find it very unlikely that the Palestinians would accept it.
I agree.
And this may be the one area where lease arrangements are used. But
Sure. No. That was good enough.
Mickey.
To that thing, that finger thing. Has anyone tested whether the blue areas example, frankly or completely any Arab character? If so, what the meaning would be? Or some pictures could take hold in people's minds. That means, for instance, an Arabic devil or whatever. It would
Not that we've heard in the negotiations.
Yeah.
No. Mickey.
Oh, I just want to make a comment that is to zoom into the aerial block and move into the photo, just so you can see that
You have a stolen car there? or
that
something?
it's not exactly a national treasure in terms of land.
Okay.
We're talking about land swaps and quality of land. It's not it.
Right.
It'll take a moment to load because it's a lot of area. Can you see? It's kind of hillish land. Is there any specific settlement you want to see here?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right. Just look at Carnation Ron area. And by the way, you can see the parts of the barrier that Israel did build here or is constructing. And these are what we call the fingernails. It's the area very close to the settlements themselves and the connection to, Israel proper, if you would, or the rest of the barrier along the green line will come in a future stage, if at all. It's a very hilly terrain. A lot of just kind of like forest, if at all, is just Palestinians that grow olives there, not much more.
Please, sir.
Chris Holt with National Democratic Institute. We had the opportunity to host Dr. Wargudi on Wednesday. He gave us a speech, and he ran through his progression of West Bank and Gaza changing borders. I'm wondering, did he see this presentation as well? Because he was very pessimistic.
No. He didn't.
We should watch that.
I didn't.
Do you have the the OCHA checkpoints and all that somewhere?
Come on, man.
Sorry. It's very sensitive. If we have any more questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, I'll just then we'll show that and make any other comments you want to make, and we'll wrap up.
What you see here is a series of. This is all. It's a little deceiving here. When you lay it out on one map, it's. You can do it. You can do a better job. But this is kind of like articulation of the vast majority of road restrictions that have put there. We have successful. Because one of the dirty secrets of the wall, the fence, the barrier, call it whatever you want, is that it never was able to create successful separation between what's east of it and what's west of it. And that is because the settlers that live east of the barrier would not allow any mechanism that would provide for better security checks along the trajectory of the barrier. Specifically, Israelis and settlers in this case do not want to be checked as they cross from the Palestinian side of the West Bank to the Israeli side of the West Bank. This is how most of the suicide bombers that have gotten into Israel successfully from the initiation of the barrier have went through the gates, because all you need is a yellow plate tag, and either an Israeli Arab or an Israeli Jewish who's just, for sake of money or whatever, would come in, pick up a Palestinian, knowing or not knowing what their intention is, and just drive with them through the checks. And if you go to the West Bank and you come back with a yellow plate tag, you see how ridiculous. I mean, they barely look at you and they wave you through. And the settlers would not agree to any sort of electronic or sticker tags that would recognize them and then would facilitate their checks being much quicker. So because of that inability to separate movement along the barrier, we, and not just because of that, for other reasons as well, I won't get into them, we've successfully established a road regime within the West Bank using checkpoints and other restrictions that separates almost totally Palestinian and Israeli movement within the West Bank.
That's it. Is there anything else you want to say?
I hope, first of all, thank you for taking an interest in this. Secondly, I hope you got something out of it. And thirdly, if you got something out of it, there are a lot of details here, but this is doable. The borders issue is maybe the lowest hanging fruit out of all the historical issues that have to do with final status. And I believe that a statement regarding the process could definitely go a long way on the borders issue as we look at Annapolis and the process after that. And that may be something that Abu Mazen can take home and create a positive dynamic on the other side with. So, so if you see Condi Rice, hint that to her.
I'll just say two things. One is to thank Dan, which I'll do in a moment. But the other is to really follow on from what you just said, Dan. And when I jumped in and I said, look, the 2% Geneva plan shouldn't be seen as a Palestinian position. But I think what it represents is that there's a Palestinian realism. Now, on the Israeli side, the wall, the separation barrier, for people who don't know, is the bastard child of disaffected Israeli doves. It's when people like Chaim Ramon, who's now Deputy Prime Minister in the Kadima Party, gave up on reaching agreement with the Palestinians, but hadn't given up on realizing how devastating the occupation was for Israel. They said, look, if we, and I'm against where the separation barrier is being built, but it's an important point. They said, look, for security purposes and to begin deoccupation, let's construct a barrier. Now it's going to end up on something like 92% of the West Bank will be the other side, the eastern side of the barrier. It begins to create a reality on the ground. Part of the reality is negative, but part of the reality is that what's on the other side of it ain't going to be Israel. And that's almost as stark from the Israeli side as the effect of Palestinian fabric of life that it has on the Palestinian side. And I think we're in a space, and I absolutely agree with you, Dan, where it's kind of made the Israeli opening position 8%. Now, if you think that Barak's opening position we'll keep about 30%. It's not fast enough. There's still too many realities being created on the ground against that. But I think, for me, the fact that you had an Israeli prime minister elected a year and a half ago on a platform that said, essentially, we will leave 92% of the West Bank unilaterally and get nothing in return. No guarantees, no nothing. To bridge the gap between that and the 2, 3, 4% deal with land swaps, I don't think would have taken an impossible effort. I think it's doable. I think the neglect on the part of this administration has been stunning. I think the late realization of the need to engage with this is appreciated, but is much too little too late, especially given the way it's politically phrased vis-a-vis the internal Palestinian dynamic. But I think the deal is in many ways increasingly there to be done, and that's what I took from this. Not that I didn't have that notion beforehand, not to be misleading. But and I think just the way you presented it, Dan, was brilliant. I've not seen, similar to Joel, I've suffered through enough of these, and I couldn't thank you enough. I think that was a fantastic presentation. I can't wait to be able to have something to put up on the website, and we'll share that with the people who are here. And thanks for spending the morning with us, but really just thank you, Dan. I think that was brilliant.
Thank you.